Okay, recording. It is recording. So far, everything's been going all right. On the other hand, I may want to destroy the recordings because sometimes I do a lousy job. But anyway, okay. Before we get into the Hebrew, let's just real briefly talk about the Torah portion. This week is called Haye Sarah. Strangely, it begins the life of Sarah because it's going to talk about the death of Sarah. At the age of 127, according to the Torah, she passes away. And so the first thing that Avram has to do is he has to arrange for her burial. And one of the interesting phenomenon is that when a new Jewish community is created over the course of the centuries, one of the first things that they do as a community is to get a cemetery. Right? Because you can pray at home, you can get people together at home, you can learn in a classroom, you can learn anywhere. But the cemetery is one of the most important things to have, and it gives you something of the history. As a matter of fact, if any of you ever get the chance, the opportunity to go to Prague, there's still the old Jewish community of Prague, what was that community, and you can see the cemetery. And what's one of the things about that cemetery is they were allotted only a certain amount of land. And when that got filled up, they brought dirt in. And then they buried on top of the earlier graves. So you have a number of headstones right next to each other. And some people thought the Jews buried themselves, vertically, standing up because of that. But it's just fascinating to see. Of course, a lot of the cemeteries of Europe were destroyed by the Nazis. Okay.
Rabbi,
So,
can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It's a little off topic, but my mom mentioned that recently she went to Israel, and she said that back in the day, Jews were buried half sitting up. Is there any validity to it, or
No, not at all. I think that's what maybe you have the cemeteries that they were so close they ended up burying on top of each other, so the headstones were there, so that may have given rise to the idea. Now, what you do have in Israel, it's fascinating if you go back 2,000 years ago, give or take, and that figures in the story with Jesus and everything that centers around the Christian narrative. There often were family tombs, and what they did was they would carve out in the earth, or they would expand a cave, and they would be buried in the cave. And sometimes what they did was they would have niches cut into the wall or on the side of the wall, and then the body was placed there. And a year later or so, after the flesh had corrupted away, the bones were collected. Some of the most ancient ones had pits in the middle, and the bones were all just deposited together in the middle of that pit. There was a period of time in which they would have little, I don't know if they were made out of stone or not, or clay, kustamot, they called them. They were rectangular boxes, and the bones would be placed in those boxes. And then a few years ago, there was a very famous discussion about they claimed to have found one that was supposedly Jesus' brother, and all kinds of hullabaloo about that. Okay. But no, the normative practices, of course, is like in non-Jewish circles, that the body is perpendicular to horizontal, with the ground. So the long story short is that Abraham purchases Kever Machpelah, which is in Hebron, and both Abraham and Sarah are buried there eventually. Isaac and Rebekah are supposed to be buried there, and Jacob and Leah, one of his wives. We don't know about the two concubines, and we don't know, and Rebekah was buried elsewhere. I'm not Rebecca, Rachel was buried elsewhere. And I was there in 1967. I haven't been back since 67. It's not exactly a great place to go, and all kinds of issues. But there's a mosque on top of that site, and you used to be able to at least go down to where those supposed graves are. It's done in a very Middle Eastern Muslim style of a kind of a half cylinder over it. You know, if you cut a cylinder in half and you put it down, that's what it kind of looks like. Okay, so the next thing, I'm sure everybody's mother has gotten onto you at some point in your lifetime. Now that Mama's dead, we got to find a husband for the boicher, for Yitzchak. So Abraham turns to his family, sends his servant Eliezer back to the homeland to find a wife. The story goes, he goes there, he goes to a well. By the way, this idea of the well seems to have been in some way the singles bar of its day, because we hear when Eliezer goes to find a wife for Isaac, he finds her at the well. When Jacob goes to find a wife or go to find his family, he meets up with his future wife at the well. When Moshe Rabbeinu and Moses flees from Egypt and he ends up finding a wife eventually, he meets her and her sisters at a well. So it's a theme that runs throughout the Bible. You know, if you're mind of the biblical critic, it's a motif, right? It's a motif that repeats itself, just like the motif of the patriarch saying that his wife is his sister. We have 3 accounts of that in the book of Genesis, Sefer Breshit, twice with Abraham and once with Yitzchak, with Isaac. So depending upon your approach, it's either just a motif or these are things that happened and that's the reality. So anyway, the story goes that Rebecca, why did he choose Rebecca? Because he didn't know who she was and he didn't go to the household to discover. It's that when he comes there, he says, prays to God, he says, may the woman who's the right one for Yitzchak offer water not only for me, but for my camels. And, you know, camels drink a lot of water. So that's a lot of schlepping of water from the well for her to do. So that proves her kindness, her chesed. And therefore, she goes in and takes care of their camels. And then he finds out indeed that she is from the right family, brings her back. There was a question about the motif of the sister. Paulina asked that. One attempt to explain it is that when you look at the stories that we have, the king, the local king, Pharaoh in Egypt, or Avimelech, 2 times, although it may have simply been a throne name for Avimelech, once with Abraham and once with Isaac. Their wives are said to be very beautiful women. And so the king or the Pharaoh is interested in them. And so he takes them. Now, if they were married, he'd have to get rid of the husband. But if they have a brother, then, he makes nice to the brother, so that makes things good, and maybe the brother will influence the sister to go along with it. That's at least one of the theories attempting to understand it. Abraham, at one of the times, does claim that Sarah is actually his sister through his father, but not through his mother. She was a half sister, according to Abraham's statement. And it, true or not true, we don't know. But we have that. There's also, if you're interested in Middle Eastern antiquities, there was an institution. It doesn't mean it necessarily has anything to do with these biblical stories, but there was an institution in which a man and woman, a man would adopt his wife as his sister. She got greater status when she was adopted by him as a sister. They find this in Hittite and Ugaritic, I think it's in the Hittite culture. Now, that was usually involved with priestesses and things like that, so I don't remember. It's been a long time since I looked at that. But that is something that at least was known in the ancient world, whether, now does it excuse the patriarchs? No. And indeed, some of the traditional commentaries said that the patriarchs committed a sin by doing this. They didn't display enough faith, and they should have had more faith. And some say no, it was necessary. Be that as it may, that's the background of it, Paulina, and for everybody else listening. Okay, so the servant Eliezer brings Rebecca back. Isaac sees her, brings her into his mother's tent, and he says he was comforted for her. Those are interested in Freudian interpretations, can do what you want with that. And then after they're married, we, of course, Abraham is no longer important in the story. So we're told a bit more about Abraham. We told about he supposedly takes another wife. The rabbis thought it was Hagar, has children with them. But in any case, he, after we're told about these other children that he has, etc., he says he dies, and his sons Ishmael and Isaac bury him in Machpelah next to Sarah. What's significant in what you would a cursory read won't make it apparent is that Abraham doesn't die until Jacob and Esau, if I recall, were 15 years old. But in the biblical account, we haven't even had their birth, and we're told that Abraham dies. Essentially, when the biblical account is finished with that figure, that individual who's been important to the storyline, they say whatever summary the Bible needs to do, and kaput, they're gone. All right. So you have to be careful. If you look carefully, you'll see that the ages are different from what it seems on the surface. Okay. So we have the death of Abraham with that conclusion. Similarly, as I mentioned before, the Haftarot, the readings that we add from the prophets that parallel in some way the Torah portion, talks about the old age of King David and what goes through towards his end of days. And so it's interesting reading just of that, having to protect his throne, his succession rather, and all of that. Okay, so that's pretty much the Parshat Haye Sarah. All right, we'll go to the Hebrew. Okay, let's see, share screen. All right, let's see. I don't remember. Did we do page 10, the letter Hay? No.
Yeah, we did.
We did.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought, but alrighty. So we're going to go to page 11, the letter Yud. By the way, there's all kinds of things that are done when dealing with the alphabet. Some of them are based on numerology. In Hebrew, the ancient alphabet, each letter of the alphabet was also a number. So Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is 1. The letter Bet is 2. The letter Gimel is 3. The letter Dalet is 4, all the way up to Yud, which is 10. And then 10 to 20 would be Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, till you get to 20, which is Kaf. Then Kaf Aleph, Kaf Bet. It's like the Roman numerals in a certain way. Okay. So one of the things about the letter Yud is, which makes it important, it's the 10th letter. The number 10 becomes important in many different circumstances throughout the Tanakh. It's also the first letter of the name of Yehudah, which is the tribe of Judah, and also is understood to be the Jew. The Pintel Yid, the little Yid, Yud and Yid, for Yiddish, the Jewish individual, They play with that concept with the yud. Now, what we're working on is the third word of the blessing, which is not really pronounced the way it looks. We'll come to that next page. But that's this, the letter yud is like the letter Y in English. And it functions exactly the same way that the letter Y does. If it's before a vowel, you pronounce it y. So like the number one will be ya, okay? If it's after a vowel, normally it gets absorbed into the vowel sound, especially at the end of a word, as we will see later on. Okay, so right now it's a yud. The yud has the equivalent value of the letter Y. So I'm going to ask everybody to unmute yourselves, and we will mumble together as we usually do the page. Okay, so we'll start with number one. Number one is ya.
Yeah.
Again, we have ya,
Yeah.
ya,
Yeah.
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 ya,
Yeah.
and you. Okay.
You.
Yeah, like one of you are there. Okay. Now, line two, the first one, we have yach.
Yeah.
Yeah, good there, guys. Yach,
Yeah.
Yar.
yar,
Yeah.
ya,
Yeah.
and yaba.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go down to three. We have ya,
Yeah.
right. Remember, the aleph only takes the sound of the vowel. Ya, yerach,
Yeah.
yachar,
Yeah.
yuchar.
You are.
Okay. Or yara,
Yeah.
yabu,
Yabu.
yarbu.
Yar.
So shall you multiply, yarbu. And finally, yarhu.
Yahoo.
All right. So now he points out what I've already done is when the yud follows a vowel, it intensifies the sound of the vowel. I don't know about that, but it's treated like part of the vowel. But what he's saying is in some cases, it makes it a long vowel. But all right, so line number 5, it's by,
By.
By.
I,
I.
Thai.
By.
Thai.
There are nice Thai restaurants in Israel. Rye
I.
and rabbi.
Rabbi.
Rabbi. Okay, line number 6. Barai,
Arai.
Bahai,
Bahai.
Rabbi,
Rabbi.
Rabbi. Not rabbi, but rabbi. And Burai.
Burai.
Burai. Who's giving that reish there, the rolling reish I hear in there? Okay. I don't do such well. Okay. Now, this is the next page. When the name of God, right, you see here, this is the way the name of God is spelled. When we want to say it's his name, like George, pardon that statement. And that's the yud Haye Vav Haye. Okay. It's sometimes referred to as the tetragrammaton. In Hebrew, it's called the Shem Havaya, the name of existence. It is thought to derive from the word for being, existence. So that, for example, when Moshe is at the burning bush and is Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, the Holy One, praise be He, gives him the job of going down to Egypt. And Moshe says, "Who shall I say sent me? What name am I going to use?" And God replies, "Eyeh Asher Eyeh." Now in Hebrew, there really, at least biblical Hebrew, there is no real such thing as tense, past tense, future tense. There's completed action in uncompleted action, perfect and imperfect in the modern terminology. So, Eyeh it means a being without end. It's not past, it's not something that was and completed. It's something that is and continues. So, Eyeh would be the first person responding, I am. You, he, you, ha, or whatever, how exactly it is pronounced, might be the third person. We're talking about God, He is. And the yud sometimes functions that way in verbs. We're not going to go into that exactly, but the yud hey vav hey, if it comes from the word haya or for being, it could mean He is. He exists. We don't pronounce it the way it is written. You can guess at how it would be pronounced if the hey indicates an ah before it, and the vav with a hey after it has also an ah associated with it. Hence we get a y and ah and a va and an ah at the end. Very early on in Jewish tradition, instead of pronouncing God's name as it is written, we substituted the word Adonai, Lord, my Lord. We talked about that last week with the messengers and coming to see Abraham. All right. And so the vowels, these vowels are associated with the word Adonai. And so therefore, when we write it with just the two yuds, and you're putting vowels, that's a tradition to do it that way. Sometimes you just have the two yuds without any vowel signs. And so when we come across it in our readings, we're going to pronounce it as Adonai. Once you get used to it, eventually, traditionally, we don't pronounce it at all, except when we're actually saying a blessing. All right, everybody with me? But right now, for you to be able to understand it and to learn to pronounce it, we're going to pronounce it Adonai. Famously, I remember one time when a youngster was doing something, and one of the problems when you teach a youngster for their bar bat mitzvah is if you keep teaching them saying Hashem or Ad Hashem instead of the name of God, when it comes to their bar bat mitzvah, they sometimes forget to change it, to pronounce it correctly the way it's supposed to be. All right, so we're going to pronounce it as Adonai. So we're going to read these three words, which are Baruch. No, everybody. Baruch.
Baruch.
Atah
Ata
Adonai.
Adonai.
All right, so it's either Adonai, if you hear an real Ashkenaz's pronunciation, Adonai. All right, that's with the komats down there. Baruch Atah Adonai, which means Baruch, blessed, praised, Atah, you, and in the name of God, Yud Hey Vav Hey.
Rabbi,
Yes.
so at the end of the word Baruch, you've got the Chaf, and at the end of the word Atah, you have another Ch sound.
Where's
So
another
the
Ch
first-
sound? There's no chus, no
So you
ta.
have Baruch,
We have
and you have
baruch.
Atah.
We have
And
baruch.
then
Then you have
so
atah.
the H on the Chaf is stronger than the H on the Chai.
Well,
or Hey.
okay, let's wait a minute. There is no H, no hey on baruch. Excuse me a second. Just a second.
Yeah, take your time. It's okay.
Hello?
Mhm.
Yes, it is. I'm teaching a class right now. Can you call me back later? About 9:30? Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry, guys. All right. We were talking Baruch. Why do you think there's a hey in there?
Well, the thing is, I'm trying to figure out the difference in the letter half, versus the
Yes.
letter A.
The
So
letter-
it goes,
Okay. Letter chaf.
Yeah.
This is the final form of it. Okay. That's the
Yes.
final form of the chaf.
yes.
And because it's at the end of the word, and they don't want you to pronounce any other vowel in it, you have the two dots in it. Baruch.
Yes. Yes.
Okay? Ata. The dot in the tav tells you that it's a hard sound, the T sound. That technically, or if you want to know it technically, the letter is doubled. At and ta. But we don't do that. Ata. We wouldn't say it that way. We just say it ata. But the dot sometimes, when you have a short vowel, and this is getting a little too deep for you probably. When you have a short vowel, you have to have a consonant following it. Here, what we have is the next symbols, the ta, well, that's the next syllable. So this T is doubled, as it were. So it's ata. The hey on the end indicates that there's an ah vowel that precedes. That's what the hey on the end is to tell you. One of the ways of defining masculine and feminine words usually end in the letter hey, and they are pronounced, whatever it is, with an ah or ah at the end. Yeled is boy, yalda is girl. And the hey on the end really just tells you that it's feminine and you have an ah sound. It's getting a little deep, I think. All right.
Yeah, I think what's throwing me off is that the half is for the sound of Hanukkah, and the sound
Hanukkah.
Hey is for the word Haggadah. So to me, it sounds like the same ha sound.
All right. Well, Hanukkah is not a hey. Hanukkah is a het. We haven't got to the letter het yet. You know why they sometimes spell it CH for Hanukkah?
Yeah.
Okay. That's because how do you write in English letters a sound that doesn't exist in English? So Hanukkah is sometimes written CH to tell you it's a ch, or in most recent phenomenon in scientific writings, it's the letter H with a dot under it. To distinguish between the chaf, which is spelled KH, if you're transliterating it. Okay. So if I were going to translate it in a real scientific way, I might, come on, why? How can I get it to not to do that? Because I'm highlighting it. What do I want to do? Oh, here, let me try it this way. So, no, that doesn't help. Oh, well, sorry, guys. All right, let's go to the next page. Can I do that? All right. So we have a review page here. Okay, everything we've learned so far. I'm not going to do that with you now. I'm going to leave that for you to do practice at home. You're at home now anyway, so you can practice there, but I'm going to leave it at that, okay? So for this page, please go over it. If you don't know what the word is, you can't pronounce it, you have troubles with it, if you don't have somebody to help you, mark it, and next week we will go over it, okay? Also, now I sent you an email today. I don't know if you got it yet or not, but in it, it has some things that about Kashrut, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But first, let's review briefly what we had last week on the issue of Kashrut. Based upon the Torah's language, the Torah's wording, we are told that if an animal walks on land, lives on land, it has to have 4 legs and cloven hoofs. We ignore the 4 legs, but because the cloven hoofs are a giveaway. Cloven hoof, that means the hoof is split, which really means 2 toes that were together, and it has to chew its cud. And cud means by that it means it's a grass eater. It eats grass. The cellulose is hard to break down, and that's why it chews its cud. It starts a digestive process, brings up the grass again, chews it some more, and it continues the digestive process. So those are the 2 elements or the 2 signs that tell you that an animal on land is a kosher animal. If it's lacking either one of those signs, it's not kosher. If it lives in the water, it must have fins and scales. The rabbis understood that any fish that has scales is going to have fins. Right? There's some discussion about which are kosher fish. I sent you a long article, which he called it, was a Battle of the Fish, I think. Just briefly, some fish are very clear, and I gave you a website where you can see a list of what are generally accepted as being kosher fish. But some fish are not always necessarily clear. Some fish there were debates over, and that whole article is about the status of the swordfish. The adult swordfish, at least when it's caught and brought on the boat, does not seem to have scales. According to most ichthyologists, the young do. They lose them when they get older.
Quick question for you.
Yes.
Why is beef only kosher from the 13th rib forward?
I'll get to that. Okay. That's not really correct. The entire animal is kosher, but we'll see why we only use the front quarters. Okay. It seems that for many centuries, the swordfish was understood to be kosher. There was some debate in the 50s and 60s as to its kosher status. Rabbi Isaac Klein, who was an important conservative rabbi scholar and decisive Jewish law for the conservative movement, said it was kosher. And that set off some of the Orthodox said, well, if the conservatives say it's kosher, it must not be kosher. And therefore, Rabbi Tendler, who also apparently earlier said it wasn't a kosher fish, insisted it's not kosher. So when people ask me, I personally don't eat swordfish, but I also don't find anything wrong with people who want to eat swordfish. It's one of those interesting things. And if you read the article of Interested, you'll see how kind of the politics got involved with kashrut, which we'll talk about more also later. Now, okay, so it lives in water, fins and scales, land, cloven hoof, chew its cud. And when it comes to birds, there are lists of kosher birds, only because we don't have any true identifying signs on what makes them kosher or not kosher. And so it basically was, if you had a tradition that was a kosher bird, it was accepted as being a kosher bird. And so when the turkey came along, there was some issues. There are some people who will not eat turkey because it's a North American bird. There was no Jewish communities less than Native Americans or from the Lost Tribes who had a history of eating turkey. Others identified it with chickens. Indeed, one of the Hebrew names for turkey is Tarnago Hodu, which means Indian chicken. And Hodu is India, meaning India, the lower continent, India. Even that seems to imply that when those giving it names thought it was a kosher, just another form of chicken. Okay, so now, along with the identification of the animal, there are several more aspects to the actual kashrut of it. Fish, once you have kosher fish, if the fish are kosher, that's the end of the story. Because they're kosher, you fillet them or you roast them whole or whatever you want to do with them, salt them, make salted herring out of them, or you want to make a fancy fish dish, whatever you want. Okay. There are no other questions when it comes to fish. When it comes to fowl and it comes to bovine, cattle, sheep, goats, you're not allowed to consume the blood of the animal. The blood is considered to be the life force of the animal. And therefore, kosher requires, first of all, an act of slaughter that severs the aorta across the neck here, and thus cuts off the blood flow immediately to the brain, which means the animal dies almost automatically. And it allows for the greatest outpouring of the blood. That's for both beef, cattle, and birds, chickens, turkeys, whatever. Then the animal has to have as much blood removed from it as possible. That's why kosher meat, fowl, are soaked and salted to remove as much blood as possible. In theory, if you're going to cook the animal over an open flame, you don't have to salt it, but nobody does that today. All right? So it used to be, and I'm old enough to remember when it was started to change over, is that you would buy the chicken. If you bought the chicken at the butcher, you had to salt it. And they call that koshering. Today, it's all koshered in advance. The beef is all koshered in advance, so the householder doesn't have to worry about dealing with that anymore. But it used to be you had to deal with it, to salt it and remove the blood that way. Liver, which is full of blood, has to be koshered by salting it and roasting it over a flame so that the blood can drip out. So any liver that you're going to have is always going to be cooked in such a way first, then you can make your chopped liver or whatever you want to make out of it. And that's dependent upon the consumer doing it. Unless you buy chopped liver at a kosher source, if it's already made into chopped liver. And well, I'll come back to, because there's an issue there about what utensil you use for it, because you want to make sure the blood comes out and doesn't come back in. All right. So we have to remove the blood. Furthermore, there are certain fats and certain sinews, especially the sciatic nerve, which is in the hind quarter of the animal, that cannot be consumed. We're going to read the story of Jacob's wrestling with the angel in a few weeks. And in that story, it says that the angel touches Jacob's side and puts his leg, it dislocates his thigh. And from then on, his descendants do not eat that sinew, that gid hanasha. So in order to eat the cattle, that sinew has to be removed. as well as the fats that are there that cannot be consumed. Now, that's not a problem with the front quarter of the animal. I don't know, it's the 13th rib, whatever number rib it is. But the issue is on the hindquarters, because in order to remove that gid hanasheh, that sciatic nerve, you have to cut into the meat. It's very time consuming. It's very difficult. And economically, in North America, in general, it's just not worth the effort, because the economics of it, the processing of it, and all of that. So you will not find in general hindquarter beef past the 13th rib for the consumer. Now you can find it in Israel, and you can find it maybe in some other places where they do trevor, but for the most part, you will not do the trevoring here. It's just too much expense. It quote ruins some of the famous cuts, like the ribeye, not the ribeye, the T-bone steak. And so therefore, you can have a T-bone, but you won't find a full T-bone steak in Israel. You'll find half of it. If I recall correctly, they don't have the whole thing together because of the way they had to butcher it. Right? So certain fats have to be removed. Certain sinews have to be removed. The blood has to be removed. Finally, the Torah says 3 times, Lo tavashel gadi b'chalev imo. You will not cook. Tavashel means to cook in a liquid. You will not cook or seethe, boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, one can be very literal and says that means if you milk the mother, you cannot use that mother's milk to cook its young. And indeed, Maimonides insists that there was a pagan custom to do exactly that. Maimonides is big on suggesting that many of the laws of the Torah are meant to negate and nullify certain practices amongst the pagans. We don't have any real evidence of that, whether or not it was true or not. And then the question comes, how can you know, especially in today, but even earlier, if I go to the market and I buy a chunk of meat from a kosher animal, how do I know if I also go to another booth and buy some milk if it's not milk from that animal's mother? There's no way of knowing. So first of all, we separate totally dairy products from beef products. We don't cook them together. We don't consume them together. We don't use the same utensils to cook them or to eat them. So that's why a kosher kitchen has to have dairy utensils and has to have meat utensils, or in Yiddish, fleischig and milchig. Now, the question is asked, well, what's the problem with eating a chicken with milk? All right, did I say it first, or did you say it, Christina? All right, you might think, why can't I have the chicken together? And indeed, we know in the Talmud that there was a Jewish community that did eat fowl with dairy. But most of us tend to think of fowl in the same breath as we think of meat. And therefore, the rabbis in general forbade them coming together. So it's actually not a Torah law, according to most authorities. It's a rabbinic enactment. And that has certain implications. There's a principle of Jewish law that if you have a certain level of doubt about what the circumstances are, if it's a biblical law from the Torah, you have to follow the stringent approach. If it's a rabbinic enactment, then you're allowed to follow the more lenient approach. So sometimes that will come into play with the chicken and milk situation. But l'chatchila, to start with, we never consume the two of them together. Dairy with either meat or with poultry, with fowl. Okay? So now, one of the issues is also, how do you, if I have milk and meat, I have a piece of cheese, a nice hard piece of cheese, and I have a raw steak, and I accidentally put the cheese on top of the steak, the raw cold steak, cold cheese, cold steak. I'm not cooking, I'm not eating, I'm not really mixing them together. So while you shouldn't do it, if you did make that mistake, you just have to rinse off the meat, rinse off the cheese to make sure nothing got attached one way or the other. Once you apply heat, the cooking process, then what the rabbis called it was tam, the taste of one gets mixed in with the other. Rabbi Allen, my associate, and I, sometime when we were studying together, we talked about it, meat molecules and dairy molecules. All right? The physics of kashrut. Once you apply heat, then they can mix in together and becomes a problem. So that's why if I make a mistake, I have a dairy plate, and again, my cold meat, and I plop it down on that dairy plate, no problem. Don't do it, but no problem. Clean both carefully, cold water especially, so it's no cooking aspect. Cooking, by the way, is defined as hot enough that if you touch it, your hand jerks away automatically. All right? If it's so hot that you wouldn't leave your hand there, that your normal reflex is to move your hand away from it, that's cooking temperature. And some people come up with slightly different determinations of what that is exactly. All right. So now, let us look at a different level. I've got my meat pot, and I've used it to make my beef bolognese sauce with that, right? Or my stew, my cholent. Today I'm cooking soup, chicken soup, and I got a pot of chicken soup. The chicken's already out of it. Let's say I've already made the soup. When my wife makes chicken soup, by the time she's finished with it, the chicken, what's left of the chicken is flavorless. All right, so I got the pot of soup on the stove, and I'm not careful. I'm drinking a glass of milk. And while I'm drinking that glass of milk, a drop or two falls into that pot, into the soup. What am I to do?
Nothing. It's an accident.
Well, so what? Just because it's an accident, if I accidentally cut your head off, I've still cut your head off, haven't I? God forbid, pui, pui, pui.
True.
True, okay. So the fact that it's an accident, yeah, that makes a difference. Difference number one, if I intentionally put that milk in the soup, I have to throw it out. Okay? If I did that on purpose, then I have to throw it out. But going back to my example, I was clumsy and got some milk in it. So how do I, if you look at it, there's things floating around the air all the time. If I'm in a kitchen, we've had this whole thing with a virus, right? You sneeze and you got viruses floating around. All kinds of things are floating around in the air. There's only so much care you can take. So it's possible that if I was drinking milk and I sneezed, you know, and the milk came out, one of the kids, right? They sneezed or spit up, right? Some milk goes flying up into the air and I don't see it, but it falls into the pot. Come on. You're not going to worry about that, although some people are crazy enough to do it. My son, for example. Anyway, so when do you have a mixture of milk and meat? When you can taste the two items. If I have a pot of chicken soup and I can taste the milk in that chicken soup, then it's no good and I have to throw it out. Now, there's some problems there. First of all, if there's enough milk in the chicken soup that it can be tasted, how can I taste it to find out if it's okay? Because I'm not allowed to eat it if it's not kosher, if it's milk and meat. So the rabbis in the Talmud had a simple solution. You went to somebody who wasn't Jewish, who was a bit of an expert cook, and you said, try this soup. Now tell me, what do you think are the ingredients in this soup? And he says, well, I can taste the chicken and some parsnip maybe. There's a little bit of this herb and that herb and a little bit of milk. Thank you very much. Good day to you. Throw out the milk. Throw out the soup. But if he doesn't taste any milk, or she doesn't taste any milk, you say, thank you very much. You go home and you eat the milk, eat the soup. Now, that becomes a problem. First of all, not everybody has a next door neighbor who isn't Jewish and is an expert at tasting foods. Because there's nothing wrong with a non-Jew having milk and meat together. It's not a problem. It's not an issue, only for us Jews. So what are we supposed to do? So the rabbis understood, basically gave a measurement. If it's 60 to 1, then that is considered to be nullified. If by accident I drop some milk into the broth, and it lands right in the broth, and there's no meat there to deal with, then I have to figure out, was there 60 times the amount of soup in the pot as the amount of milk that fell into it? If there are 60 times the volume or 60 ounces, milliliters of chicken soup and 1 milliliter of milk, it's batel b'shishim, it's nullified by 60. That's what we call bitul b'shishim, not nullified by 60. Under normal circumstances, in the case of an accident, unintentional, then we say that is the dividing line. Now, sometimes there's more. For example, something very sharp in taste, it may take more than that to nullify it. And you know, if it got, you know, but if it's dealing like what I was saying, just some milk falls into a pot of soup, or some chicken soup falls into your dairy soup that you're making. If the volume relationship is 1 to 60, then it is okay after the fact. Okay, another case. I'm going to make some kosher hot dogs. And so I put my 2 kosher hot dogs on the counter on a paper plate, ready to take it out to the barbecue. And my next door neighbor, Christian, comes in. I say, hi, Chris, how you doing? He says, fine. How are you doing, Marty? And he happens to have a hot dog in his hand, and he puts it down on the plate next to my other 2 hot dogs. Normally, I look at it and I say, well, that's his hot dog. You know, take it away, please. Don't leave it near my hot dogs. In the story. But what if they're identical? Not only are they identical, he puts it down and hits the plate and they go flying across the counter. And now I've got 3 hot dogs in front of me. One is not kosher and 2 are kosher. In theory, I could stick all 3 of them on my kosher grill and grill them and eat all 3. because the majority is nullifying the minority. Normally what we do is we would remove one of them and throw it away, because even though you have the majority minority, then when you take one away from it, you perhaps even took away the non-kosher one for sure. So that's what we generally do. So when it comes to solid food, we call it batel barov. It's nullified by a majority. That's
question for you.
less often to come across. Yes.
So if this 60 majority thing's a rule, why couldn't you just do like 60 parv meals on a plate and then switch it from meat to dairy?
Okay. Now we come into what we call the law of taste, and to use the made-up physics of kashrut, the meat molecules. Okay. Now remember, I said if something is cold, we're only concerned that if you put different things on it, you might have some residue left that can cause a problem. But if I have, let's take the pots, all right, because that's the easiest deal to start with. When I cook in a pot, certainly prior to many modern alloys that we have today, if you look at the pot after it's been used a number of times, it begins to get discolored. The rabbis understood that some of the meat gets absorbed into the pot, the meatiness. You're gonna have to excuse me just a minute. I have an issue. I have to do it.
Hey, you guys. What does this 60 to 1 mean that it's nullified? That means it's allowed or it's not allowed?
It is allowed.
If it's 60 or higher, so the ratio has to be 60 to 1 or higher.
What does that mean?
So 1 gram of, say, I don't know, 1 gram of milk.
So like 60 grams of meat?
No, and 60 grams, 60 grams of something else maybe, right?
Yeah.
Nah.
It's 60 to 1. 60 to 1.
Is the idea of 60 meaning majority?
If it's a solid, not a liquid, we have two different categories. There are liquids. Liquids mix very easily, right? You can't separate liquids very easily. And when they are cold, or even if they're hot, the rabbis felt that the taste is not enough of the other taste to be tasteable when it's 1 to 60. When they're solids, the idea is the majority rules. If the majority were not kosher, then you have to throw it all out. The majority of this were kosher, then you could rely on that majority. Okay, so now let's get to the way the rabbis understood it. Okay, the rabbis understood it that when you cook, some of the flavor of what you're cooking goes into the walls of the pot. And when I cook in that pot again later on, the heat causes some of that taste to go out of the pot into whatever I'm cooking. And now if I have a meat pot, I've cooked meat in it, and then I turn around and cook dairy in it, some of the meat flavor that was in the walls of the pot will now go into what's being cooked in that pot, thus mixing meat and dairy together. That's the concept. So when it comes to hot stuff, that's where we start with from that principle. Plates, sometimes you put very hot foods on a plate. And so you have the same issue. So to start with, that's why we say we separate totally the utensils and the silverware, the flatware, the plates, glasses, even some are very strict in using separate glasses. I don't mean the spectacles, I mean the drinking glasses for meat and milk.
Rabbi,
Yes,
can this issue solved by Hagala in case of the pot?
yeah, okay. Now, if for some reason I need to use this pot for something else, we're not supposed to go back and forth between things, but let us say I need a very large pot. The only large pot I have is a meat pot. I could boil, let's start with silk flatware, because that's easier. All right, let's say I got some forks and I made a mistake. And I took my dairy spoon, stuck it into my boiling soup, chicken soup, to stir it up, and I pull it on. Now I've got a spoon that was clearly in hot liquid, and it's said to have absorbed the chicken into it, the taste of the chicken, which now has gotten mixed with the taste of the milk that's inside that spoon from having been used with dairy stuff. Now, if it were plastic, I'd throw it away and then store it. We don't do that. What I can do, how did the meat or the dairy enter into the walls of a pot or into the walls of the flatware? Through heat, in hot water or hot liquid. So the way I can remove it is to do it through hot liquid. So first of all, we say that if I made a mistake with the flatware or a small pot, I let it sit for 24 hours. After 24 hours, the rabbis say whatever taste is there is really not a good taste left in it. They call that notain tam lifkam. And I take a pot that's not been used. It doesn't matter what flavor. Hasn't been used also for 24 hours. I fill it with water, get it boiling. And once it's boiling, the flatware, I can put it in there for a few seconds, take it out, it's kashrut. Rinse it with cold water, put it away, it's okay. It's now neutral. I can use it for whatever I want to use it for. Similarly with the pot that was used on the top of the stove to boil things in. If I have a real big pot and I can't put it in another pot of boiling water, you very carefully fill it as high as you can get it, get the water boiling, and then you get a rock or a piece of metal hot, carefully drop it into the water so that it flows over the top and goes down the sides of the pot, and it's kashrut. And it starts afresh. That's Hagala. All right. Now, that's the same thing applies with Passover, and we'll mention it again when we come to Passover. Now, that's for utensils that were used with liquids in them, your cooking pots. But if you roast it, if the only thing is you roast it over a flame, then you have to remove the way the meatiness or the dairiness gets into it is because of being heated by the flame, not by the water. So in that case, what you have to do is you have to remove it by application of heat. Either you can blow torch it, or as far as most are concerned today, if you have a self-cleaning oven, that's hot enough temperature to take care of that. That applies to all metals. The rabbis understand, now when it comes to pottery, the rabbis in general were of the opinion you could not kosher pottery. And therefore, because in order to get it hot enough to remove the problem, it would break it most likely. You could send it back to the kiln and heat it up that way, if that would survive. And especially with glassware, the glassware that they knew of was very fragile. And so it was more easily broken than ours is. So when it comes to pottery, the answer is it's no good anymore. Now, how does that work with dishes? Most authorities are of that opinion that, if you have a dairy plate and you put your hot steak on that plate, the plate has now been trafed. You can't use it again. There are opinions that say if you leave it for a full year without being used, then whatever taste was there is gone and is no longer problematic. The Chacham Tzvi is famous for that psak halacha. Not everyone necessarily agrees with that, but when people ask me, Rabbi, I have my grandmother's china. She didn't keep careful kosher. Yeah, she did or she didn't, whatever the case may be. And it's a beautiful, I want to be able to use it. Actually, we have my wife's, one of her grandmother's set like that. You can rely on the opinion of the Chacham Tzvi to leave it away for a year and then use it. Some are not so happy with that, but that is certainly doable. Okay, so now getting back when I was talking about liver, now we say the way that the taste comes out is the way the taste goes in. So if I am cooking liver on a barbecue, let's say, that was normally used for regular meat that's already been koshered, the blood that leaves the liver, some of it's going to get absorbed into the barbecue grating. And when then I put meat that has been koshered on it, the blood that came out of the liver will now go into that meat, and I'm going to be eating real blood in that meat. So that's why we use a separate grill if we're going to kosher livers, and we don't let it sit in the juice, as it were. You have to let it go out. Similarly, if there's a person who has an issue with salted meats, there are people in the past, today, I don't know how, if you can get meat that's not been salted, but they would do the same thing. They would use a barbecue grill, or they use a grill that's used only for the meat that wasn't koshered. And therefore, whatever blood was in it would drip out. Also, we have to understand, if you've salted and soaked the meat, whatever is left is not, quote, is not blood. Okay? Once you've done it, if you've done it properly, then you can have, like I do. I like my steak. If I put a fork in it, it moves. Not moves, but moves. Yeah, I like mine, very rare. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the assumption is once you've salted it and rinsed off all the salt and everything, any blood that was left in it is now gone.
The red from a steak is not blood, it's the proteins breaking down.
And now we got a scientific answer that backs up the rabbinic answer. There you go. All right. Sometimes the rabbis knew what they're talking about. Okay. All right. Now, so we've got meat products. We have dairy products. We have a third element that are considered to be neutral, or in Hebrew, parv, which comes from parva. Those are, if the item is a vegetable, and that covers all the growing things, right? Tomatoes, apples, cucumbers, asparagus, mushrooms, whatever grows, right? Doesn't come from a living animal of some kind, are neutral. You can cook with chicken and mushrooms. You can cook a mushroom cheese quiche, not together. But there is the mushroom itself the vegetable itself is considered to be neutral and usable with any other of the other two. Once you have cooked it using a milching pot or a fleshing pot, there's some issues that come in there, and preferable not to get involved with that. But for example, actually in theory, if I made a big pot of beans in a dairy pot that was not used for 24 hours, I could then use those beans, eating them on a fleishik dish. The Ashkenazic tradition is we don't eat it with something that's actually meat because it was cooked in a dairy pan. But it's not really dairy because it only absorbed the taste that was absorbed, is what we call notain tam bar notain tam. The taste went into the utensil, and then the taste went out of the utensils into the product that you're cooking. And since it's a neutral product, that's the principle there. You don't need to remember the Hebrew notain tam bar notain tam, don't worry. But we still avoid, for the most part, doing that because you can have issues that come about. Because I'm looking to see. So those are the basic ground rules. Seasonings are not an issue, although you have to be careful. And that's where kashrut supervision comes in. I provided you with that sheet. Let me find text. Where was that? Okay. I'll get there in a second. There used to be a time when you just relied upon the person who you're dealing with. If they kept kosher, then you weren't worried about it. But issues come up. People don't always act the way they should. And so in the modern world, we have supervision to make sure everything stays kosher. There are many reasons for that. Today we're more sensitive to mixing things, but in earlier ages, you didn't necessarily know for sure what went into a food that was made somewhere. And so in the 20th century, a number of organizations were developed to supervise various products. And they would go to a company, or the company might come to them and they would say, look, we want to be able to use your product, or they might turn around and say, we want to expand our clientele to include the kosher community. How can I make sure that people will buy my product? So what they said was, we will send somebody to check you out, check the ingredients, check how you process everything. And if everything is okay, then we will give you a mark that is trademarked, that can't be used without our permission, to indicate that this is a kosher product. So that, for example, here in Toronto, the Kashrut Council of Canada is actually located here in Toronto. And if they supervise a product, let us say cake mix. They will look at it, make sure all the ingredients is no problem, because sometimes there are problems. Anybody know what monosterites are? Anybody ever hear of that? Monoglycerides, diglycerides, all kinds of things that are derived from various animal fats. So they would supervise it, check it out. Every once in a while, without warning, they could come into the plant and make sure that everything was honky-dory. or kosher, as we say. So amongst the major ones that we're familiar with here in Toronto and that are acceptable by the local VOD, which is core, is the core symbol. This one is from Montreal. Calgary, I'm not sure I've ever seen anything. British Columbia, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Quebec. The UO is probably the largest one that's around. It's the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations. It's usually called the OU, but it's really the UO. I don't know how it got that way, because the O's are outside the U. The OK or the Circle K, not the grocery stores, the corner stores. The Star K, the Kaf K, and the KSA. All of those are major, widely accepted symbols of being kosher. And if that's on a product, then you can rely that that product was supervised to make sure it was kosher and nothing non-kosher got into it. And that's pretty much in North America, that's how we handle it. I know in England it's a little bit different, but if you're going to England, then you'll talk to your rabbi about what you have to do there. Similarly, while there was a time when you really shouldn't have had a problem with bakers and butchers and all of that, over the course of time, it's become more and more accepted that you have to have some kind of supervision to make sure that the bakery is kosher, that the butcher is kosher, etc. So if you go to a grocery store and you want to buy a product, you look around and you'll see if it has one of these symbols on it, then it is something you can use. You always have to look at it, be sure what the ingredients are in it, because occasionally there's a mistake made or they don't always identify it. Usually if there are dairy products in it, it will say it's dairy. If it's meat products that are not absolutely clear that it's meat, they will mark it. But you buy a hot dog, you assume it's going to be meat. I hope anyway. If it's a non-meat, it's a protein hot dog, then they will label it what it is. So they will label it as meat or dairy. They will label it if it's kosher for Passover. All those labels will be there. Now, if you go to your regular grocery store, and you never know where you're going to find things that are kosher labeled, because some of the major food producers feel it's worth their while to pay a few pennies per product, or even not, it's even less than a few pennies, probably tenths of a penny, to have their product supervised because they increase their clientele. A lot of major products do that, not because there's a huge Jewish population that's out there keeping kosher that buys their products, but there's enough that it can help them in their business. It's not a kosher tax. One of the anti-Semitic slurs that you hear every once in a while is, why do they have to pay a kosher tax? Nobody pays a kosher tax. If a food producer wants supervision, they pay for the supervision. And they get their money back, presumably, by expanding their sale of their product. So now, if I want to buy kosher meat, I have several options. I can go to a kosher butcher. There are a few in Toronto still left around. I can go to a grocery store that carries kosher products. Some of them, well, Sobeys, for example, the Sobeys here in Thornhill has a large section of fresh kosher meat. As a matter of fact, you can't find the non-kosher meat so easily. Right? It's a very large kosher section, bakery, etc. You can go to Walmart and find kosher, even fresh kosher products in Walmart and in No Frills in this area. Now, if you went to downtown Toronto, that might be a different story. The grocery stores are going to carry what products are going to sell in their neighborhood. Just like you may have more Chinese products in stores that are servicing larger Chinese communities. And so, it's usually somewhere, and you go to a grocery store, even in the middle of nowhere, you can probably find at least some cookies that are kosher. I don't know if you want to survive off of cookies, but all right. Now I'm going to touch upon a couple other items, and then I'll open up for if there are any more questions tonight. Chicken, we said, is treated as meat. Chicken eggs that have been laid are treated as parve. You can have the egg with anything, with dairy products or with meat products. You can't find it today, but it used to be that you could buy a hen and she would have, that's been slaughtered, eggs still inside the chicken, which were a delicacy once upon a time. Those are regarded as meat because they have not yet had the shell attached to them and they not yet left the body of the chicken. Also, there was a concern, I don't know if I gave you that article or not, about the issue of a blood spot on an egg. The rabbi said that if the egg was fertilized and is beginning to form a chicken and reach the stage where the fetus of the chicken, I guess it's called a fetus, the embryo is starting to develop, you cannot eat it because it's no longer just an egg, but it's not become a bird that you can slaughter, so you can't eat it. And so if when it used to be, if you found a blood spot in an egg, you would throw the egg away. Most eggs today are produced on farms where there are no roosters around to impregnate the hens. So really, if you want to be strict, you can throw an egg out if it's got a blood spot. Or, which even many authorities, Orthodox authorities would say, if it's got a blood spot, you remove the blood spot. And you go and eat it because it's unlikely to really be an embryo. Because the likelihood of being an embryo is infinitesimally small. Some rooster snuck in when the farmer wasn't watching or something. Okay. And so it becomes when you buy cooked egg, that's what when you buy egg products, if they usually have supervision to make sure that they didn't see any blood spots to speak of when they're breaking the eggs and opening. But again, that's more of a stringency than an absolute requirement. Similarly, there was the tradition that when you would boil eggs, you would always boil 3 eggs at least a minimum of 3 eggs, or an odd number of eggs, so that you would have a majority that most likely would not have egg spots in them. The likelihood of having a majority of the eggs having a blood spot in was very small, so that's why there's a tradition of always boiling more than an odd number of eggs, beyond 1. So that's the story with eggs. Now, cheese has a long history of issues that were surrounding it. Cheese is made by taking milk and taking an enzyme, rennet, which causes it to coagulate. And it used to be the only way you did that was you got the rennet that was from the cow's stomach, calf stomach. And there were issues of kashrut around all of that. And so up until the modern era, generally speaking, the insistence was that you had to have the cheese come from a kosher source, for sure that they were making sure that there was nothing used in it that wasn't kosher, including mixing any kind of milk besides cow's milk in it or goat's milk in it. Because in parts of the world, they use the milk from camels, they use milk from horses, pigs, whatever. Today, with labeling issues, it's not a question. And some permit cheeses because they say the rennet that is used has already gone through chemical processing that renders it no longer considered to be the original meat product that it was. You won't find that very much in Orthodox circles, more traditional circles in the conservative movement. Some will, and some will not eat cheeses that don't have a kosher hechsher. And then the last thing is wine. The rabbis ruled that you're not allowed to have any benefit from anything that was used for idolatry. If something was used in the worship of an idol, that becomes totally forbidden to a Jew. And it used to, in the earliest of the winemaking days, back millennia ago, part of the process always entailed pouring out some of the wine as an offering to the gods. And they call that yayin nesach, wine that was used as an offering. And so that wine, if it was used for an offering, even only part of it was forbidden for Jews to consume, have anything to do with it. When that was no longer the case, the rabbis ruled in a strict manner, just to be sure, to be safe, that any wine produced by a Gentile was not to be consumed. Now, there are two parts to that. One was the fear maybe there might be some issue of yayin nesach, the wine being used for idolatrous purposes. And the second, that wine was the drink of socialization. When you socialized with people, wine was the drink that you drank. And in order to maintain a separation between Jew and Gentile, to obviate intermarriage, one of the things the rabbis said was you cannot use any wine that was produced by a Gentile. Now, in the conservative movement, Rabbi Silverman of blessed memory, who was a rabbi in down the street there, Hamilton, thank you. In Hamilton, he did an investigation of wines that were produced in North America. And he said, the wine that is produced here is never touched by a hand. Nobody ever touches it. And it's almost all, pasteurized. Pasteurized wine was not considered to be usable for putting on the altar. So he said that if it's wine that is made in North America, he felt that it comfortable saying you could use it for social purposes. But for Shabbos and for benching, for making blessings, he preferred to have wine that came from Israel. Of course, I don't know what you say about all the wines that come from all over the world that are kosher wines. But anyway, that's what he said. But the more stringent approach is any grape product has to have a hechsher on it that says that it is completely kosher. So even your jellies and jams that are made from grapes would be supervised that way. Now, jellies and jams obviously are not produced just by Jews. And even the wines that are produced by Jews are usually just supervised by someone, but a lot of the work is done by non-Jews. But they never come into contact with the wine itself. Even if I remember I saw when I visited a winery in Israel, they had the, I forget what's the title, the person who's the wine master of the vineyard, of the place. And so he was not Jewish, but they would sample the wine periodically during the course of the wine aging process. So the mashgiach, the rabbi with the beard down to here and the black coat, would come in, and he would have the ladle, and he would take the ladle and put it into the cask where the wine was aging, pour from that ladle into a sampling cup that the non-Jew could sample it from, and then the guy would sample it and say whether it's okay or not. So he never came into contact with the wine itself. Not only that, I remember visiting one of these wineries, and the mashgiach, the rabbi with the dark coat, the long beard, and everything else, wouldn't even let the Jews, even if they were observant Jews, even touch the kegs on the outside. All right? So nobody came in contact except this guy who was paid to make sure it was okay. Now, Adi asked about pasteurization. The rule was very strict. The rule was so strict, it says even if a non-Jew opened a bottle of wine, that wine was no longer usable by an observant Jew. However, an exception to that was when I said about wine that was pasteurized, what they call it mavushal, yayin mavushal. Any wine that was cooked was considered to be non-usable for yayin nesach, for pouring on the altar. Therefore, if a non-Jew opened the wine, it was okay. So if you go to a kosher function, if they have wine there, all of the wine will be labeled mavushal or pasteurized, because most of the waiters are not necessarily going to be Jewish. And therefore, there's no concern that somebody's not Jewish comes in contact with the wine or the open bottle. Right? But that's the story with wines. Does that answer your question, Adi? Okay.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions that we touched on tonight?
I do have a question, actually, Rabbi.
Sure.
Going back to the meats and the dairy, what is the background for that? What is the religious aspect or the scientific reasons behind
there is
it?
no scientific reason. You have to understand. There have been those who've always tried to say the laws of Kashrut have something to do with health rules. Okay, we come across that. People say that health, why are swine forbidden? Well, because pork, you get trichinosis from it. Why were shellfish an issue? Because there are other kinds of diseases, or sometimes with shellfish. But the problem with that is, what's the problem with eating a horse? There's nothing health-wise in terms of the horse, right? I mean, I don't, horses are nicer looking than cows maybe, but okay. And even Maimonides did want to say that he thought it was an anti-pagan introduction, that the pagans had some kind of ritual in which they would cook a kid in its own mother's milk as a sign of fertility. But we don't know. As I expressed last week, there is no rational answer that one can really come up with. There were some rabbis say, well, by keeping kosher, we might, Jews are healthier. No, that doesn't work that way. There are many very healthy, very strong non-Jews who consume plenty of non-kosher items. They're no less healthy or more healthy than a Jew is. Jews didn't escape plagues any more than their Gentile neighbors escaped plagues. But it is a discipline. One, it's a discipline. It is a way of making what you do a way of worshiping God by limiting the consumption on how you eat, what you eat. You make the act of eating more than merely the satisfaction of a physical need. It now becomes a spiritual activity as well.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so that's how. That's the best answer I can give for it.
Okay. Perfect.
Because all
Thank you.
we try to do is to be a holy people. Christina, when we said before about parts of an animal, certain fats, which nobody wants to eat, they're usually mostly around the intestines and some of the hindquarter fats that are usually removed. They're generally removed anyway from any kind, but that we can't eat. We can't consume the I'll come back to Adi's suggestion in a minute.
Sorry.
That's okay. So there's certain sinews, those sinews and some of the fats, those are basically what we cannot consume. And if you go to the grocery store and you buy packaged meat, it's all going to be okay. There's a tremendous amount of really fine kosher wines in the world. I would never drink anything that's Manischewitz unless it was absolutely necessary. Some people love it. I like my wines nice and dry. There are some very fine kosher wines out there that will set you back a pretty penny if you want to pay for them. All right. There is a winery in Niagara called Safona, and they make some nice wines there, including a nice wine. I like their white one, but I'm not so thrilled with their Cabernet Sauvignon that they make. But maybe I have to try it again sometime. Okay. Anything else? Okay, glassware. Okay, when it comes to glassware, it's differences of opinion. Now, remember I said the glassware that the rabbis of the Talmud knew was very, very flimsy glass, not like we have today. And if it's porous, then you have to kasher it by boiling it out. Well, that's a problem. Is glass porous? Not really. So there are some who will say you can use your glassware, your drinking glasses, whether for milk or for meat, without any problems. Some would even say you can use glass dishes for both milk and meat. But there's issues about getting them clean and maybe some residue or something on there. So most people are more stringent than doing that. Koshering glasses, there's no clear understanding of that. Some say you just rinse them out. End of story. Some say you put them, you soak them for 3 days, changing the water every 24 hours. More of a symbolic way of koshering them. Okay? So the simplest answer is, you can talk to your rabbi if you've got questions about glass things that you want to use. I don't worry to myself. We don't use glass dishes for both. We try to separate our drinking glasses, but I'm not really terribly concerned with them being mixed with each other. And if you put them in the dishwasher, the fact that you put dishwashing, once you put in soap and water, the flavor of the soap ruins what's ever there, so that's not an issue as well. Okay. Anything else that I didn't touch on? Okay. All right, so today's the 11th. We have a class next week. The 25th is when we're supposed to have our exam. What I'm planning on doing is I will send you the exam a few days before. You take it, and then we will go over it on the 25th together. Okay? All righty. Have a good week, everybody. Work hard.
Thank you.
Learn hard. What I sent out to you was more informational. I'm not worried about your memory, but please be aware of the kosher symbol. Oh, I do know one thing. The letter K, the alphabet letter K, is not copyrighted or trademarked in any way. Sometimes a product will have the letter K on it saying, we say it's kosher. Who is the we? And what is the basis of that? We don't know. When you have something like the OU or the circle K or the cuff K or the star K, all of those are symbols that if you use it without permission, you can be sued and pay a penalty. And that's why they're more reliable. The letter K by itself doesn't mean anything. Okay, you can't rely on that per se. Okie doke. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you, Rabbi. See you later. Good night.
All right.